going to talk a little bit today about the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation, which is based at the University of Mississippi. I have the honor of being the executive director of that institution, and Charles Tucker is our associate director. I want to tell you a little bit about where the Institute came from. At any point, if you want to stop and ask questions, please do so. We're going to talk a little bit about where we came from and a little bit of the work that we're doing, what we're learning from the folks in our communities. And then we want to show you a short film about some of our work with young people. And then we want to open it up for questions and conversation, if that's okay. Does that sound all right? And can y'all hear me okay? Okay. So the Institute actually grew out of President Clinton's initiative on race, if y'all remember that, in 1997. It was the first time that a sitting president had called for a national conversation on race without that having been sort of precipitated by a perceived crisis. And we were at the University of Mississippi. Many of you probably know it better as Ole Miss. And that is an important nickname. It is, in fact, the name that enslaved persons called the mistress of the plantation. And so that tells you a little bit about the university. It was literally founded in 1848 to protect the ideology of slavery. The plantation owners who were sending their sons off to Harvard and Yale in the 1800s were finding them coming back far too liberal. And so they wanted to create an institution that would protect the ideology of white supremacy and slavery so that they would be able to preserve that institution. And when the Civil War began, the entire university closed down and all of the students formed their own regiment called the University Grays. So just a real strong sense of ties to the Confederacy and all that meant at that university. So in 1948, when the Democrats included the first civil rights plank on a national platform, half of the Alabama delegation to the Democratic Party and all of the Mississippi delegation walked out and formed the Dixiecrat Party, which Strom Thurmond ran as president. And some of you may remember that Mr. Lott got into a little hot water making some remarks about Mr. Thurmond's leadership. That didn't bother us at all.
No.
We must say.
Were you surprised?
No, I wasn't actually surprised. I had hoped that he might be slightly smarter than that, but nevertheless. So, the University of Mississippi, as many of you may know, in 1962 was finally forced to desegregate. James Meredith, with the assistance of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Constance Baker Motley, and Medgar Evers, who had tried to desegregate the school in '54, right after the Brown decision, were successfully able to do that. But of course, it came at quite a cost. The governor of the state at the time, Ross Barnett, tried to stand in front of the schoolhouse door, and many folks have called it the last battle of the Civil War, because the Kennedy administration sent in federal troops and federalized the National Guard, and there was a riot on the campus. 2 people were killed. No one has ever been held accountable for those murders, but Mr. Meredith did desegregate the school. It is a legacy that when I came to school there in 1992, no one officially at the school wanted to talk about. And there were all kinds of contentious debates about the symbols associated with the schools. The Confederate flag is part of the games. The mascot of all the teams called Colonel Reb. The football team, who were mostly black students by the time I got there, literally wearing Confederate gray football pants. So just this sort of steeped in that kind of stuff. And so when President Clinton decided that it would be great to have a national conversation on race, there were those of us who thought, well, good gracious, we certainly need to have one here. And as you might imagine, the university was slightly nervous about doing that. We were fortunate in that the former governor of the state of Mississippi, William Winter, who I think we can argue pretty successfully is the best governor the state of Mississippi has ever had, was governor from 1980 to 84. And, for instance, mandated one term. In fact, at the time, you could only do one term. Now you can do two. That's how we got Haley Barber for the last 8 years. That's a whole other story. But for instance, during Governor Winter's administration, he successfully passed with quite an aggressive campaign the Education Reform Act of 1982, which became a model for other education reform acts across the South. And it was the first time, for instance, that we had mandated kindergarten in Mississippi in 1982. So just a little sense of how far we have to come. So, and he was also very progressive on race, and he in a sense of confession, was raised in Mississippi, and so was raised to be an acolyte of segregation, but served in World War II, and had really transformative experiences about how things were wrong. And so he's the first governor of Mississippi, for instance, that invited Myrlie Evers Williams, the widow of Medgar Evers, to visit the governor's mansion. And he told her when she visited, your husband didn't just free black folks, he freed us white folks too. So this is the kind of leadership that Governor Winter has displayed. And he was appointed by President Clinton to serve on the advisory board of the Initiative on Race. So those of us who wanted to have some conversation at the university about Mississippi in kind of open and honest ways reached out to him, and he was fantastic. He really sort of shielded us from the university, which wanted to be cautious, which wanted to try to control the conversation. And he basically didn't know me from Adam, but told the university to do whatever I told them to do, which is just, awesome. And so what we chose to do was to really, I had studied the civil rights movement as a college student, as a graduate student, and Ella Baker is one of my heroes. I wrote my dissertation on her, and so she wrote, yes ma'am, thank you. And obviously she'd been formative in spending a lot of time in Mississippi and in shepherding and guiding the students of the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So we wanted to create as grassroots a process, as open and honest and frank a conversation as possible. And we knew that nothing substantive was going to happen for 2 hours in front of some camera. So we wanted the advisory board to come into the middle of a conversation that we were already attempting to have so that there would be some sustainability after that happened. Now, the others of you may know John Hope Franklin was the chair of that board. My God, what a giant. Starting in 1998 in January, we pulled together dialogue groups of people to talk about race in particular constituency topics, right? We wanted people to get really focused. So we had artists in a group. We had environmentalists in a group. We had high school students and college students. We had religious leaders. The few labor folks that we could find in Mississippi, we pulled those folks together.
I'll speak on that.
We reached out to the healthcare community. We could not get a doctor in our community to join us, but we did get nurses to join us. And that we understood why as we heard what the report was. And then though the university wanted to sort of handpick who got to speak, again, Governor Winter said, no, we want to protect this process that Susan's group has put together. So that the folks, 160 people, met every week for 6 weeks and talked about how race sort of played out, racism and played out in those areas. And then we're going to make recommendations to the advisory board about those areas. And they elected their own spokespeople to represent them. So on a rainy night in March of 1998, 1,000 people joined us in Fulton Chapel on the campus of Ole Miss, right where the circle is where the riots took place. And these courageous leaders stood up and shared their observations about race and racism in our community of Oxford and we call it Lafayette County. I think y'all probably call it Lafayette up here. And the president's staff at the end of that year, which was overshadowed by, I think, some extracurricular activities that Mr. Clinton was involved in, said that our event was the most successful because it was a frank but civil conversation about race. It was the best attended, it was the most integrated event that they had. And I think that it was the first time that the University of Mississippi was mentioned positively in the New York Times about race. And I think that gave the university a sense of, oh, maybe there's something to this sort of civil, open, honest dialogue. And I think that it maybe even began to understand that they had an obligation because of their history to try to do something about these issues in Mississippi. And so out of that, Governor Winter came to the chancellor and said, how about we formalize this work? How about we create an institute to support community leaders coming together across racial lines to make Mississippi better? And that's what we did. So the institute was formed in August of 1999. We renamed it for Governor Winter on the occasion of his 80th birthday. He's 88, by the way, and going strong. He no longer jogs 3 miles a day, but he does walk every day.
Goes to work every day.
Goes to work every day.
Practicing attorney.
So February of 2003, we renamed the Institute. And I remember that when we were doing the initiative on race, the chancellor's staff said, well, what should we be doing to help you? And I said, well, gosh, President Clinton has asked for us to have a year of dialogue on race. Why don't we have a year of dialogue on race at Ole Miss? They said, that is never going to happen. Well, it took 5 years for that to happen, so that in October of 2002, which was literally the 40th anniversary of the desegregation of the university, we were finally able to get the university to inaugurate a year of dialogue on race. And we kicked that off with what we've come to call sort of a ritual of atonement, that the university came together, that the chancellor apologized to the African American communities in Mississippi for exclusion of black folks from the university. We had 2,500 people eating catfish dinners in the circle where the riot took place, and we invited back all the folks who had not been honored as heroes and sheroes at the time. So the U.S. Marshals, the National Guardsmen, the troops that protected Mr. Meredith. Mr. Meredith was there. Constance Baker Motley was there. Duncan Gray, who was the priest, the local Episcopal priest who was almost killed trying to get people to go home and not participate in the riot, he was there. Sidna Brower Mitchell, who is a student, who was the editor of the Daily Mississippian, who had been censured by the student government at the time for supporting integration, was there, and the current student government revoked her censure and gave her a commendation, right? The mayor of the city gave keys to the city to all the National Guardsmen. And Robert Kayatz, the chancellor, stood on the front steps of the Lyceum where the riot took place. In fact, there's still the bullet holes in the columns and above the door, and apologized. And then he and Mr. Meredith led everyone through those open doors to the other side of the Lyceum where we dedicated the space for a civil rights monument. It was really significant that this happened because, I would say every governor up to this point in Mississippi has gone through the law school or gone to Ole Miss. I mean, it's where the public officials go, right? So people look to the leadership of that place to gauge, right, to be their barometer of what they need to be doing. So that event was very significant in encouraging other communities to begin to look at their history. So in 2003, that next year, the community of Newton, Mississippi, in Newton County, it was Newton and Decatur. They had been the community where Medgar and Charles Evers were from, who had tried to go register to vote at the courthouse there when they got back from World War II, and they were not politely escorted out of town.
The terms run out on a rail.
This community came together, a biracial group, and asked if we would support them in creating another sort of ritual of atonement. And Merle and Charles came, and the community came together and apologized. But they also wanted to change the sort of geography of memory of the community, right? So they put a historic marker up in front of that courthouse to say what had happened there. And they began to do education in the schools about what had happened in that community. And then in 2004, I got this phone call from a board member who happened to be from Neshoba County. Neshoba County is the place where 3 civil rights workers were murdered in '64. Y'all may know it as the infamous Mississippi burning case. And he said, I want you to go to Neshoba County because they're having some conversations. It's going to be the 40th anniversary of the murders. And I must tell you that I was scared to death. Because all I knew about Neshoba County was bad stuff, and certainly knew that it was a community that knew who the murderers were but let them walk free for 40 years. If there were people there that wanted to try to do the right thing, then we wanted to be where they were. So we were invited in by the community two really interesting men who had gotten a friendship in the integrated schools there in Neshoba County. Leroy Clemens, who was had just been elected chair of the NAACP for Neshoba County on the platform of doing something about the case, and Jim Prince, who had just come back to town and bought the newspaper, and they pledged to come together to do something about the case. I'd love to turn it over to you to take up that story, because you do it so well.
So there you have two guys, both went to high school together. Leroy Clemens, Jim Prince. So they got together with some members of the various local groups. How much do you know about Philadelphia, Mississippi, by the way?
Just one thing, the New York Times just the other day.
Yeah,
It's been on TV every once in a while,
every once in a while.
especially in February.
Especially in February. That's about what people know about Philadelphia, Mississippi. It's a nice town, it's a logging town. Primary industry is lumber. There is a huge Choctaw reservation that's part of it. So you have Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is the town, Neshoba County, the surrounding county, and the Choctaw reservation. Lumber being the primary industry. And that was the engine that ran everything. And that engine was controlled at that period of time by an organization known affectionately to some as the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had a grip on that town, the likes of which you cannot imagine. And the people who murdered Goodman Cheney were members of the Klan. Now, we all know from watching that movie that the poor fellas were killed, that there was a collusion involved, there was conspiracy and a cover-up involved. A whole lot of bad things were involved in this. And then after that, it pretty much, the movie leaves it there. And that's where that town has been fixed in the public consciousness ever since. Well, when they came together, it was 40 years coming up on that date. And time had moved on. This time will move on for all of us. We grow older, we go a little grayer, we gain a little weight. Town gets a little bigger. Things change. Things don't change. But they decided things had changed enough to where they wanted to present a new vision of their town out to the public consciousness. Because here was the deal. Every February, this is what people heard about Philadelphia. There would be, in Black History Month, Dan Rather or somebody like that would drive up to the city limits of Philadelphia, Mississippi, stop the car at the sign, get out of the car, get their camera crew, pull up and say, "Not much has changed in Philadelphia, Mississippi since that dreadful night." Then they would cut.
He's been practicing that for years.
Then they would cut to film footage of what happened. Then they would cut to footage from the movie. And if they interviewed anybody who lived in Philadelphia, Mississippi, they had lived in Philadelphia, Mississippi 20 years earlier. We're now living in New York or Boston or LA going, "Oh, it was bad back then. I barely got out alive. I just don't even like to think about that town anymore." And that was the public image of Philadelphia, Mississippi. And they said, "We've got to change that. Things are better now. We can just show, we can tell our own story. And doggone, it's the 40th anniversary, we're going to do this." So Jim got together with his group of people and associates, and Leroy got together with his group of people and associates. They got people from the Chamber of Commerce together. They went over to the Choctaw Nation, got their people together. They said, "We're going to all meet together and we're going to talk about this. And we're going to get together as a united front, and we're going to tell these folks to come into town and talk to somebody who actually lives here and can tell them the real story." I said, okay. So they all came to a place called the Depot, which is a converted railroad depot in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the chamber meets. They all sat around a table kind of like this one. They said, "This is what we want to do. Does anybody have any ideas how we ought to proceed?" Well, one fellow, white guy, said, we should sign a proclamation. And everybody was nice and polite. But black guys and black folks in the room kind of went, okay. And Native American folk kind of rolled their eyes. But everybody was polite. They didn't say anything. They were all very polite about it. And so somebody said, well, let's just, we'll just put this on the side for a second and let's get some other suggestions. So somebody else, black person, said, I tell you what, let's have a march. We just get arm in arm, we'll just march down through the middle of the town and we'll meet up at City Hall all together and we'll just present ourselves and just tell them up front. And every white person in the room turned white as a sheet of paper. But they didn't say anything. It was all very polite. We're very polite people down south. So, that's a good idea. Anybody else? And Native American folk just kind of sat there and looked. Because they're saying, nothing I've heard rock my boat yet. So they kicked it around for a while and they said, well, it's been 2 hours, let's call it an evening, we'll meet again later. And they all got up and said, powerful meeting, it's good to be, good to see you too, glad to see you, can't wait to meet next time. And they all filed out the room until just Leroy and Jim were left. And they, no,
Black and white.
Leroy's black, Jim's white. They went to high school together. But they're real good friends. And they can pretty much talk about anything. They'll argue like cats and dogs, but they'll still talk about everything. And they said, what do you think of that meeting? I said, that's nice. Everybody was real polite. Yeah, I didn't think it went anywhere either. And Jim said, Leroy, can I ask you something? Leroy said, sure. What was wrong with the idea of the proclamation? Leroy said, Jim, let me tell you something. To us, black folk, that's just words on a piece of paper that you may or may not choose to honor depending on how you feel. And if you really want to be serious about this, ask our Choctaw brothers about what they think about that. You familiar with the term treaty by any chance? And Jim sat back and went, I hadn't thought about that. And he said, well, since we're putting the cards on the table here, and Leroy said, yeah, but let me ask you something. What's wrong with the idea of a march? I mean, we all going to be out there together and everything. And Jim said, look, let me tell you something. When you mention march to white people, they think of the news media coming down and hoses and dogs and Al Sharpton showing up and Jesse Jackson coming in and cussing everybody out. And they just can't stand it. And Leroy said, I had no idea. I mean, especially since y'all use on the other side of the dogs. I don't see why that would bother y'all at all. But I guess I can see your point. You just don't want folks just rushing up in here and calling y'all, backwards and stuff. He said, that's pretty much it. He said, okay. He said, we wasn't thinking any of that. He said, well, we wasn't thinking any of that when we said proclamation. And at that moment it dawned on them. They'd been sitting in that room being all nice and polite and speaking English, and nobody knew what the other one was saying. He said, we need to call another meeting. So they called another meeting. And they said, but before we do, we're going to need some help. So they reached out again to the Winter Institute, and that's where they called in Susan. Now the story it says that she rode in with this cowboy hat on, which she actually didn't do. She bought the hat later. But what she did was she called everybody into the room And they said, we're going to put on the table, let's forget the 40 at this point. We're going to talk to each other, and we're going to tell each other our stories. Because it's clear we don't know each other. And we didn't know that we didn't know each other. And we didn't even know that we didn't speak the same language until just now. So how many weeks did it take?
We met every Monday for 8 weeks in a church, in the church where the 3 civil rights workers had been stopped and arrested on suspicion of arson, by the way.
So for 8 weeks, they sat and talked. And in that 8 weeks' time, they learned some things that had stunned and shocked everybody, black and white and Choctaw. For example, Leroy Clemens, who was chairman of the Philadelphia Coalition, by the way. Leroy Clemens? Clemens. He learned something that just stunned him. He learned for the first time that white people were living in fear of the Klan. He had no idea. Like most black folk there, he thought, well, if you're white, you're probably a Klansman.
You're all right.
You know, and if you weren't a Klansman, they just left you alone. What he didn't know was this. For the system that the Klan had in place to work, everybody had to toe the line. And if you didn't toe the line, it wouldn't work. So to make sure you toed the line, they could threaten your family. They would threaten your children, your wife. And it didn't take much. For example, if you worked in a sawmill and you worked next to him, and one day you guys got paid and he looked at your check and he said, well, how come Smitty didn't get paid all of his money? All he had to do was say it out loud. Now, he might go home. When he gets home, when his wife comes home from work, she might come in and say, you know, I almost got run off the road today. Some crazy guy just swerved right into me. And he might not think anything of it, but when he got back to work, there'd be a note next to his helmet saying, shame what happened to your wife. Open your mouth again, it might be fatal. Or your children could suddenly have a snake pop up in the locker at school. Or your wife could get beaten up. Or if you were a weak man, they threaten you. But usually if the guy was tough enough to say something out loud, they figured he didn't care about you coming after him. So they went after his family. Black folks had no idea that folks were living with this. White folks were living with this. Now on the other side of the fence, all white folks thought all black folks blamed them for everything. Now, black folks knew some Klansmen, some folks were Klansmen, some were okay. Some were scared and weak. And you just had to be careful around them because, if they get pressed, they might flip on them. But they didn't blame everybody for it. They just were wary. But white folks were told that all black folks think you're all part of us. So no matter what you do, they'll turn on you because they think you're guilty anyway. And the Native American people found out, who, by the way, had helped some black people get out of some scrapes and helped some white people get out of scrapes, had found out that black people didn't know that they had done it. So when they said, you never acknowledged we even helped, it's because they didn't, it was never known. So all these people had all these things going around in their minds. And they never knew if they were true or not. But they were their truths. And it served to keep everybody separate. Another thing about Philadelphia, Mississippi. I have friends who grew up there and did not know about Goodman, Cheney, and Swearingen until they were adults living in other places. These were white people because their parents would not speak of it, because if they spoke of it, they could wind up dead.
I'll just share a little bit about Deborah Posey, who was one of the members who came to join the Philadelphia Coalition, a white woman who had been married to the cousin of one of the triggermen, Buford Posey. And she had been taught all of her life that these three young men were bent on changing their Southern way of life, that they were dirty, hippie, communist freaks, and that they deserved what they got. And then one day she saw a picture of them, and they didn't look dirty to her. She didn't know what a communist looked like, but they just seemed like clean-cut, nice young men. And she said, if that was a lie, what else have I been told was a lie? And she started this process of education. She began to read everything she could read. She left that marriage and left that family. And in the weeks leading up to the creation of the coalition, by herself, not having talked to anybody, she would go every week to the murder site and pray for the redemption of Neshoba County. And then she saw this thing in the paper that this was happening, and she came one day and she said, is it okay if I come? Now, she met Jewel Rush McDonald there. Jewel, our mother and brother were at Mount Zion the night that it was burned, and they were beaten by Klansmen on their way back home. And Jewel spent that whole summer with her. She was getting married at the end of the summer. She spent her whole summer with the trousseau in the chicken coop because they were terrified the Klan was going to come and burn the house. And that was all she had. And she left Philadelphia at the end of that summer, and she did not come back home until her mother got sick, and she came home to take care of her. So she had a lot of obvious grief and frustration and anger. And within the context of the coalition and them sharing their stories, she and Deborah became good friends. And Deborah apologized to Jewel for the beating of her family. It was those kinds of bonds that began to really create a intertwined, inextricable group of people. And it became obvious to them what the next step ought to be.
So what was their next step? Now remember, they all got together because they wanted to do a nice public civic park. They didn't want Dan Rather to come up there, park by that sign. So what was going to be their next step? But this is what they decided to do. They said, well, if we just get a 40th anniversary thing out of this, we can do much of anything. And besides, now that we know what we know, we can't go back to being the way we were. We got to do something about this. You see, because here is the sticking point, as my grandfather used to say. The guys who did it were still in the community. And every day they drove up and down those streets. And they'd go eat at Dots. And they would go about their business. Some of them even brag about it. And everybody knew it. But for years, that grip, that little system I described, had it where no one would dare speak about it. They said, if we have learned anything out of this, we have got to do something about that.
And when one of them, who was part of the conspiracy, did choose to speak about it in his old age, he died in a mysterious farming accident. Seriously.
Yeah.
Cecil Price,
Cecil
who was
Price.
involved in the murders, spoke up and spoke to the Attorney General, and then died mysteriously.
So,
When he was confessing his involvement, so
well, a lot of folk, when they get old and they see the end of the road coming up, there you go. And Cecil Price, the rumor is, saw that there was a pretty warm spot waiting on them down the road. And he wasn't too thrilled about that. So you don't say go get right before you get left. Cecil was, this is just a rumor now. but Cecil might have been thinking about that. Well, anyway, so here we have the Philadelphia Coalition, as these people start to call themselves. And they said, if this civics project we have is all we do, we haven't done a doggone thing. So they said, we're going to call together our little group, and we're going to call together everybody, and we're going to do just what we said. But this is what they did. They went and talked to, was Attorney General? Was it Jim Hood back then? Mm-hmm. Jim Hood. Jim Hood, who's the Attorney General of Mississippi, and the guy who's single-handedly trying to bring the mullet right back. They went up to him. Well, it's true. There's his mullet and his cowboy boots. He went up there to visit him.
It's still on you back.
Yeah, he's trying to bring it back, y'all. And they said, we want you to reopen this case. Something has to be done. We know who it is. And we as a community cannot tolerate it any longer.
And they did that publicly in a ceremony with 1,500 people and 4 congressmen, and they got Haley Barbour there to join them in the call for justice.
Now, Haley Barbour is not exactly a friend of civil rights, but he does know a really sound political play when he sees one. And there was no way he could not back that without looking like a jackass.
Mark Duncan and Jim Hood convened a grand jury of local Neshoba County residents, and they indicted Edgar Ray Killen on January 6th, I love to say, the day of Epiphany in the Christian calendar. And so I had the surreal experience of being in the courtroom the next morning when they brought in Edgar Ray Killen, and sitting behind his brother, who, when he found out who we were, explained to us that we would not be invited to the funeral, and we told him we were okay with that. And going through, sort of all the process then of how the media came back and wanted, finally beginning to tell a different story about Philadelphia. And in June, 41 years after the murders, there was a 2-week trial. Local jury, black and white jury members, and on 41 years and a day, the local jury found Edgar Ray Killen guilty of 3 counts. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He serves time at Parchment Penitentiary, where, of course, the Freedom Riders had been taken and placed on death row in '61. But I must tell you that, the night after the Philadelphia Coalition made the call for justice in 2004, we had a potluck, as we do, in the church, and we got everybody together and we said, okay, are you done? And they said, no. If all we ever get is a trial of an 80-year-old man, we will have failed our community. If our children don't understand this history and how to prevent this history, then we will have failed. If the rest of the state of Mississippi doesn't get engaged in these conversations, then we will have failed. And so the 30 minutes after the verdict was read, the Philadelphia Coalition stood with Rita Bender, who was the widow of Mickey Schwerner, and they called on the state of Mississippi to engage in a truth process. And in 2006, so this verdict was 2005, in the legislative session, which was the next legislative session in 2006, the Philadelphia Coalition and others of other community members, along with the Winter Institute, spearheaded legislation that was passed and signed by Haley Barbour that mandates teaching civil rights and human rights history in all Mississippi classrooms. And so that is how we've begun to build on this work of being open and honest, of building relationships strong enough to bear the weight of the truth that we have to tell, and then engaging in local and state level policy to bring equity and justice to the communities that need that so much in Mississippi. And we do that through a process that we call the welcome table, from one of our favorite civil rights songs, "I'm Gonna Sit at the Welcome Table One of These Days." And it includes all those elements of relationship building and self-reflection, asking people to do a lot of inner work, and then some education about the structural inequities that racism has built, and then training as the community leaders identify together what they want to do in their communities. At a certain point, I think we realized that if we didn't make this as intergenerational as possible, then it wasn't going to be sustained. And so back in 2010, along with the support and advice of Merle Evers, who wanted to really re-engage with youth work, we created a Summer Youth Institute program. We bring high school kids from all over Mississippi to our campus for 2 weeks, and they learn relationship building tools. They learn about civil rights history. We take them to Philadelphia, and they do the civil rights tour there. We take them to Greenwood. And then they work on a project that they're going to do when they get back home to make their communities better, that they identify. So, for instance, in Neshoba County, the 2 young women who came in 2010 at the first program, Shamiski Collier and Cache Bowler, learned that about a third of their fellow students weren't graduating from high school because they were dropping out because of pregnancy. And so they got back home and they said, we want to start a youth group that prevents teen pregnancy, that lets kids know about what their options are. And they did that. They started a group that was 2 kids in 2010 that now has 60 kids. It is multiracial. They have Valentine's Day dances to raise awareness about options that you can take instead of sort of getting pregnant. And there hasn't been a pregnancy in the black community, in the teen black community in Neshoba County since these kids began their work. And it was in the top 18 counties in Mississippi in teen pregnancy birth rates. So this peer-to-peer work is working. Devontae Wiley, who came from Greenwood, Mississippi, was really concerned about food deserts and inequities in availability of wellness programs and stuff like that. And so he got back home and he got a meeting with the mayor of Greenwood a week after SYI and got the mayor to donate property, city property, and they have started a community garden in Baptist Town, which is a very distressed sort of part of town. It's where Willie Starks first called out Black Power, right, on that March Against Fear in '66. And so now there's this rich community garden that's providing some good food and some mentoring for students who get involved in that program. So we'll start again a little less than a month now. We'll have 28 more students who are coming.
How old are the kids?
They're rising high school sophomores and juniors. And we're going to be expanding for next year. We've actually just yesterday, we sent out an announcement to all 8th through 12th grade schools. We're asking them to get engaged in understanding their local history and especially the overlooked figures in their community who have fought for civil rights and for racial justice, and to do some kind of documentary project on those folks and bring them all together next June, which is the 50th anniversary of the murder of Medgar Evers. And they're going to share what they've learned about their community leaders, but they're also we're going to have a youth congress and ask them to create a youth platform for racial justice that we'll go with them to present to the legislature in the 2014 year. So that's a new project that we're kicking off that we're very excited about.
Where do you get funding for everything you do?
We are completely privately funded. We have raised all of our own money. We do not get any state money or support from the university except for the really spectacular offices that are nothing like these lovely.
State donors?
You know, we started out, it was very important to us when we started out that we be able to show local investment. We didn't believe that national funders would want to fund us if they couldn't show that Mississippians were interested in this. So we did get a lot of local donors, and then there's a foundation there that it's called the Robert M. Herron Foundation that normally funds more conservative stuff. They had only funded the business school at Ole Miss. The money came from oil and gas, but they love Governor Winter, and they invited myself and Governor Winter to come and speak about our work, and then they gave us a lot of money, and they stopped giving money to the business school, and they give money to the Winter Institute. And so that has really led to now support from he's very loved. And then so now the Kellogg Foundation We are colleagues with Smitty in that, and the Fetzer Institute has also given us money in Open Society, but we're completely, totally privately funded. Absolutely, we're part of the university. So the university has a 501c3 educational designation. So folks
under
get
that umbrella.
tax deductible donations.
Do you have a line item that you can receive funds from for your?
Yes, ma'am. Any gifts go directly. No, my mama would reach up here from Georgia and slap the back of my head if I don't. It's engraved. I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. The University Foundation accepts donations, and it just has to say for the Winter Institute on them. It's a great question. You know, while Philadelphia was happening, we received a phone call from folks in Macomb, which was the bombing capital of Freedom Summer, right? And let me say, we only go where we're invited. So folks in Macomb called and said, could you come and support a conversation here? And where that led is that the school superintendent at the time of Macomb school system asked if we could support him in developing civil rights and human rights curriculum in his schools. And he required all of his faculty and staff to go through anti-racism training. And now they have a certified and Kellogg-supported endeavor to teach civil rights and labor history in Macomb, Mississippi. It's really the model for the rest of the state. They have after-school programming. Their kids, it's improved their kids' test scores. The students competed for the first time in National History Day, and they won second place. They're up in Maryland now, maybe, competing. And they did another sort of these sort of rituals of atonement. So in 2006, in Macomb, I should back up. Right after the day after the kill and conviction, the Philadelphia Coalition had, we didn't plan it this way because we couldn't have known when the trial was happening. We had a civil rights education summit for teachers because we wanted to make sure to prepare local teachers to teach civil rights history and not teach, that Martin stood up and Rosa sat down and now everybody's free, right? We wanted an accurate portrayal of history. And Macomb folks came to that, and so they asked if they could host the one the next year in 2006. And so they did, and as part of that process, in '61, when Brenda Travis had sat in at the whites-only lunch counter at the local bus station, and she was arrested. She was 15 years old. She was kicked out of school, and the principal of the school announced to the student body at her school that she would not be allowed to come back to school, and every single one of the students got up and walked out and marched down to City Hall, and they were all kicked out of school as well. And they were told that they would not be allowed to come back to school unless they signed a waiver saying they would not participate in civil rights activity. They all refused to sign it. And so they had to go find other places to graduate, okay? So the class of 61 in 2006 were brought back and given honorary diplomas from Macomb High School. And Brenda Travis was there to receive the accolades of her fellow members. And this, nobody even knows this. This was a sidebar sort of thing, but there was a young white guy who had been growing up in the community at the time. He'd gone off to Vietnam. He'd gotten the Bronze Star. He came to that ceremony, and he pulled Brenda aside before the graduation started, and he said, I know now what was happening that I was, implicitly a part of. And he gave her his Bronze Star award. So those are these kind of moments, right? Okay, so then it sort of has been this kind of ripple effect, right? So as Macomb was beginning to gear up, we got a call from Tallahatchie County. And Tallahatchie County is the place where Emmett Till was murdered. And of course, his killers were allowed to go free.
The town is called Money, Mississippi. There is no money in Money, but it's called Money, Mississippi.
Yeah, there's the dilapidated store where he supposedly whistled, and the courthouse where the trial took place is in Sumner, Mississippi. And so a biracial group came together there, and we spent, it took a good couple of years in Tallahatchie County. And Jerome Little, who was the gentleman who called us in, he wanted to do what Philadelphia did. He wanted to issue a proclamation and call for justice and apologize. And he was African American, one of the first African American officials in Tallahatchie County. Frank Michener was the white plantation owner who owned the plantation that Jerome had grown up on. And he said, I didn't kill that young man. I don't owe anybody. an apology. And so the night that we talked about doing this sort of proclamation, he walked out. And bless her heart, Betty Pearson, one of those heroic folks, she called him up and she said, Frank, would you at least let Susan come talk to you about it? And he said, okay. So I called him up and said, when can I come? And he said, you can come anytime, but I'm not changing my mind. And I said, that's okay. So I drove over one afternoon, a beautiful day like this, and sat in Frank and Judith Michener's living room. And I asked Mr. Michener if he would just tell me their story. You know, what was their experience of growing up as privileged white people in Tallahatchie County. And he talked about how progressive he perceived his father to be, you know, that they treated their workers well. And I just listened.
You only whooped him every other day.
And just how pained he felt that the only impression that people had of his county was, you know, that they let these guys go free. And I said, Mr. Michener, I appreciate so much that that's been your experience. And I said, the problem is that nobody else has ever heard these words from a white person's mouth in Tallahatchie County, right? Because the jury represented you. And the jury freed 2 gentlemen who murdered this young man. They confessed it within 4 months of the trial. And so because no one else has ever challenged that, that's the official record. That is what everybody thinks. And if you're cool with everybody thinking that for the rest of your life, then that's fine. But if you're not, then you need to say something differently. And so he said, hand me the statement. He said, let me see if I can play with it and change it and make it something I can sign. And I left him. And the next meeting, we came back together, and Mr. Michener came into the room, and he said, I want to ask the entire commission if they will sign this proclamation with me. And I had written it before. He had only changed 2 words. And so in 2007, in front of the courthouse, the what they called themselves, the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, invited Till's family. So Wheeler Parker and Simeon Wright and all the family were escorted into Tallahatchie by the Tallahatchie Police Department. And they came into the courthouse steps where we had set up the stage, and the coalition offered this apology to their family for the miscarriage of justice in that case. And they have now put up historic markers at every significant site related to Emmett Till. And there's an Emmett Till recreation center where kids have after-school programming. And there's now an exchange program between Tallahatchie kids and Neshoba kids. They both go to each county and get the civil rights tour at each place that we support. So there's other stuff, but those are kind of the 3 highlights.
In addition to that, we're also active in Jackson, Oxford, Greenwood, Tupelo,
West Point,
Mississippi,
and the Gulf Coast.
And we're also working with people in New Orleans. By the time we came in, a lot of the Klan had died out in Philadelphia. The Klan does this. It ebbs and it flows in terms of its membership. You got some hardliners that will always, they're going to die and they're going to wrap them up in their robes and they're going to plant them in the ground, and that's just going to be it. You got other folks who the Klan fell out of fashion with them, so they packed their robes up and they stuck them in the attic. You know, Merle Evers, there's a quote, we have a film we were going to show that she says the Klan doesn't wear robes, racism doesn't wear robes anymore, it wears a Brooks Brothers suit. And that's actually very true. Back in the day, you had divisions the way things broke out. You had the Sovereignty Commission, who were like the legislators and the city fathers who ran things. And then a rung below them, you had the White Citizens Council, and they would be like business owners, bankers, people like that. Then you had the Klan, and they were the road guys and all that kind of stuff. Now, you had the wrecking crews under the Klan, and those were the guys who actually went out and did the dirty work. So you had guys like Killen, who would be in the Klan. He would call together the wrecking crews, and the crews would go out and actually beat people and do things like that.
And Beckwith was like that.
Beckwith was
he
one
wasn't
of
part
the
of
wrecking crew. So you had those kind of levels of division. So by the time we had gotten into Philadelphia, a lot of these people had either died out or had it fallen out of fashion, and they kind of let it kind of die out. Now, when we started getting a big pushback from the Klan was after the election of Barack Obama. That sent a ripple of fear through these people, and they start dusting off robes like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, talk about 2009 on this.
Yeah. Any y'all football fans?
Yes. Yes.
Depends.
Yes.
Depends on the team.
All right.
Yeah, right, yeah, right, I was gonna
What
say.
team are you talking about?
Yeah, right, that's it.
I'll not be getting into the specifics of the team right now.
Oh, yeah.
But any of you have watched the University of Mississippi play football, you know the team is the Ole Miss Rebels. The University of Mississippi is two things in one. It is the University of Mississippi, the academic institution, and it is Ole Miss, a cultural icon. That cultural icon has very little of anything to do with the actual academic institution. They just occupy the same space. Remember how Susan said that Ole Miss had been created to perpetuate the ideology of slavery? Because of that, you have white supremacist groups all over the place that look upon Ole Miss as the bellwether of their cause. If you attack it, you get neo-Nazis sitting in, we support their cause, you are our symbol, you are our light. You get all that kind of stuff. Now, all that was important for me to tell you this, and this is what happened in 2009. Usually, when the University of Mississippi would play football, they'd go out there, they would score a touchdown, however rare it may be, they would score a touchdown. The band would play this song called From Dixie with Love. This was what was called the reconciliation anthem. It starts out as Dixie, and midway it segues into the Ballad Hymn of the Republic. The first official mashup song of the world. So they would play this song. And at some point, some bearded up individual in the stands found out that when you get to the part where it says, "His truth is marching on," you can jump up and yell at the top of your lungs, "The South will rise again." And so if you'd ever watch these games in the stands, when they get to the end of that, you would see all these people shoot to their feet and yell, "And the South will rise again."
It was mainly students.
Mainly students, but a lot of old dudes. You know, if you got arthritis in your back, you can't jump up like you used to. But mostly students. Now, when Dan Jones came in as chancellor, who's our current chancellor, he wanted to get rid of it altogether. He said that song triggers the yelling of this chant, and that's a bad thing because it's just bad. The student body said, government association said, we want to phase it out gradually so we don't have a whole lot of trouble with it. We'll just ease it out, and that way folks will they won't act a fool. He said, all right, but if they act up, I'm pulling the plug on them. So he told them, the chant is forbidden, we'll let you play the song. And of course, they played the song, and some bearded up guy jumped up and then started all over again. So Dan Jones told the band, you can't play the song anymore. As soon as he made that announcement, a series of YouTube videos started popping up with this guy in a red Klan Grand Wizard's robe claiming to represent the Northwest Mississippi chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was going to rescue Ole Miss, not University of Mississippi, mind you, rescue Ole Miss from Dan Jones and those liberals and black people up there who are trying to make a mockery of our Southern heritage. He was standing there with this oriented strand board wall behind him, and he would rant and he would rave. YouTube videos going viral all over the country. On and on. Well, it was coming up toward the University of Mississippi LSU football game. Better than homecoming. ESPN game day. They were going to be broadcasting live from the Grove. He announced, me and 100 of my rogue brethren will descend upon Ole Miss, and we will take back our Southern tradition. And we are going to give that liberal what for? That's a quote. What for? What for? And so he said he filed his, we're a state university, so you can come on the state campus. We can't ban you from the campus. They said, yeah, you can come. You're going to be right here. You cannot go off this point. And he said, fine, I'm bringing 100 Klansmen with me, and I'm coming strong. They were going to do it on Saturday, game day. ESPN had all their live cameras set up in the Grove. Now, how many of y'all watch game day? So folks are always going to have their little tailgating and all that up there. They had all these cameras lined up there. And the ESPN guys were up there and said, is this true? Y'all gonna have a Klan show up? He said, yeah. He said, uh-huh. We got a trick for them. You just wait. We got something for them. So what? You just watch. Meanwhile, we have the Grove. And the Grove is this huge, big quad area in front of the Lyceum, in front of that. And the tradition is for all these families to put up their pavilions and their tents, and it's highbrow tailgate. And they bring china, and they have butlers and maids and all that stuff. And the ladies who lunch have the pearls and high heel shoes on, and they lay rugs out so the heels don't anchor them in the ground and they can't go anywhere. The boys have on their blazers and their pressed khakis, and you can shave with the crease in them. There's just like the Sperry Docksiders on walking around. And they were all getting set up. Now, the kids, meanwhile, had heard about this. They said, we're not going to have this. We're going to protest. We're going to do a counter-protest. Now, years earlier, old man Barrett, you familiar with Richard Barrett? This is a guy who moved from New York down south because he felt a kinship with the South, and failed lawyer, but he kind of instituted himself as the wannabe head of the white supremacist movement. He was later killed by the black inmate that they allowed to work on his property after he made a pass at the brother, and the brother took him out. That's another story. But they'd had printed up some T-shirts back then that said, turn your back on hate, or blank on the front and had turn your back on hate on the back. So the kids had gotten some more of these T-shirts, and they were going to go right next to the area where the Klan was going to be, and they were going to turn their backs on them, and they were going to recite University Creed when these hundreds or so Klansmen came in. But for these kids, it was an odd thing, because some of them, their parents had told them stories about the Klan. And others, well, the Klan was something they read about, or they'd seen in movies, but nobody actually really did that sort of thing. But as it got closer and closer, the kids got scared and scared, but they weren't going to back down. So we met with them the night before, and we said, look, don't worry. If it comes up to it, we're going to buy you time, you get out of there. Don't worry about that. We got you covered. You do what you're going to do. So that morning, we all showed up out there, the kids with their T-shirts, and we looked up, here come the teachers. They were putting on T-shirts. And you had people from town, they came and they put on T-shirts. And we looked up and said, we got any more T-shirts? No, we're running out of T-shirts, man. Well, we got these say no to hate stickers, so we got these stickers out here. And then all of a sudden, we looked around and we hear this noise, and it's a god-awful noise. And we realize it's the ladies who lunch, and they're all on their smartphones fussing. And they're like, yes, it's true. Yeah, they're here, they're coming. They're going to ruin everything. Don't they know we're going to be on TV? Oh, this is terrible. This is terrible. Dear, come here. One woman called her husband over and she said, do you have any more of those stickers? She grabbed a handful of stickers, started slapping them on her husband and on her kids, going, dear, what is that? Don't shut up and put this on. I don't know if they agree with the Klan, disagree with the Klan. It's just the idea of being shown on national TV with the Klan. That wasn't going to happen for them. They weren't going to have it. These women were stomping around in their high heel shoes and shooing their husbands around. And the guys, yes, dear, whatever you say, dear. One guy had a sticker here, and one on his back where his wife had just nailed him. And then the wild card hit. Do you guys play LSU up here?
No. Yes. Southeast.
LSU is SEC school. Cajuns out of Baton Rouge.
We know all about it.
This is a Saturday game. They started drinking Wednesday night. They showed up with 2 tickets in one hand and a 6-pack in the other. First ticket for when they get in a fight, you throw them out, they get the other ticket and get back in. They come in drunk, loud, boisterous, in a wave. And they came in going, what's going on over there? We got the Klan coming. One guy says, Mississippi fans. One Mississippi guy came in there, what's going on over there? Klan, LSU fans. And then someone said, Klan's coming. We can fight them. And they all swirled like this, away from. Here's the football stadium here. Here's Fulton Chapel. They all did this number here and turned around like this, and they just came there like this, waiting. They were drunk and they were ready to fight anything that moved. One guy was so drunk, he was staggering. He said, I'll kick you. He stumbled and he turned to a blank. I'll kick your tail too. His friends turned him back around. They're going to be over here. Our kids came in and they filed up and they took their positions. And they were standing there and they were shaking. They were so scared. But they were holding hands. And 2 girls in our group, one of them's father was a president of the Jackson Urban League. He told her stories about having to tangle with the Klan when he was a kid. And she was shaking like a leaf. But she planted both those little feet there and she said, I'm not moving. Others, our play daughter, Melody, sweetest thing in the world, got a heart as big as this room. Melody stood there, tears rolling down their eyes. They were so scared. Those are the loudest voices you could hear. And then came the Klan. All 5 of them. They came around the corner, and they paused, saw the crowd, and one dude got on the phone, called down to the Stuckies and said, guys, you got to get me some people down here quick. So then 6 more guys come down, they had rental robes, and they put them in them. So there they were, 11 Klansmen on the steps of Fulton Chapel. And the guy in the red robe must have washed his wrong because it was hot pink.
It was real pretty.
It was nice. He was probably from the San Francisco chapter. We wasn't sure. And they come out, and they had 3 flags. One the rebel battle flag. One was a rebel battle flag with Dixie Forever written on it. And the other one had White Power written on it. And they come in waving their flag, and as soon as they open their mouth to say something, that crowd opened up on them, yelling, screaming, howling. A few of the University of Mississippi fans came in. They're screaming and yelling too. One guy said, and then this is where the guy messed up. He said, Dixie forever. And the guy said, it's your fault. We can't play Dixie anymore. I'll tear you to pieces. And they went off. The LSU fans said, can we hit him now? And our kids over there reciting the University Creed at the top of their lungs, shaking like leaves, because this is the first time they'd actually seen the Klan. And you see them peeping over there, and their eyes are like saucers. And they're just looking at them. And they're looking at them, they're holding hands like this. And meanwhile, I'm standing here, kids are here, I'm standing here, another guy was 6'8" standing next to me. 2 guys in the National Guard that walked by and said, what's going on? We told them what happened. They said, we'll be back. They came back in jeans and sweatshirts. They said, we can't be in uniform, but we're going to be here. So we're lined up in a skirmish line right here. Cops are walking around between us, but the cops are not protecting the Klan for the first time. The cops are trying to keep the LSU fans off the Klan. And so they tried to talk, and then about the 12-minute mark, the head of student government walks over to him and goes, you about through? He got, yeah. And so the Klan files out. They had their cars all parked, trucks all parked. They were all in pickup, so they could get out fast. They jumped out of their robes, jumped in their trucks, and laid rubber getting out of there.
The courage of our students. I know we run over time, but.
I
Right.
think that you should get a prize for being a great story.
Absolutely.
Sorry, going along.
That's great. Those are great.
Slightly different topic. What's happening with voting rights down there?
Oh, it's really awful.
Oh, yeah.
What's happening to counter that?
There is a grassroots movement that's being led by the ACLU to try to reject voter ID, which of course our state, our voting populace passed last fall. We're hoping, I mean, it is being challenged in the court, and a similar law has been struck down, so we're hoping ours is going to be struck down. They do look at Mississippi carefully. And then there's a grassroots effort to try to get people to counteract that at the local level. So we're hoping. You know, people got so understandably wrapped up in the personhood amendment, which I was so proud of my state for rejecting, and frankly surprised, that I think that they just the voter ID stuff got in the cracks. But now that the personhood stuff is done with, at least for now, I think people are turning their attention to the voter ID stuff. Yeah.
Wasn't there a, I'm sorry.
This actually was done about 5 minutes ago, so we can wrap up.
Yep.
Only because the keynote.
And we're happy to answer any questions outside of it.
Clarification, wasn't there a black mayor elected in Philadelphia?
Yes, there was.
First black mayor
First
who's a
black
member of the
mayor.
coalition, James Young.
Who was this?
James
James
Young.
Young. First black mayor in Philadelphia, Mississippi was elected.
After the trial.
After the trial.
Thank y'all so much.
This